A crossroads of duty and humanity. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a constant backdrop to the whirlwind of activity in the ER. Nurse Sophia Wallace tightened her ponytail and checked her watch. Her shift had just begun, but chaos had already erupted. The emergency room buzzed with the controlled frenzy of professionals juggling life and death. Sophia had been an ER nurse for 8 years, a role she loved despite its challenges. Her colleagues often joked about her unshakable resolve and meticulous adherence to protocol. She wore her professionalism like armor, her calm demeanor a shield against the unpredictable tide of emergencies. But that morning felt different. Sophia had just finished dressing a child's minor burn when the blare of ambulance sirens signaled the arrival of a critical case. She turned toward the bay as paramedics rushed in, their voices clipped and urgent. A young man lay on the stretcher, barely clinging to consciousness. Male, early 20s, severe trauma, suspected internal bleeding. Hit and run. One paramedic reported, his brow glistening with sweat. Sophia's eyes locked onto the patient, his pale face framed by dark, damp hair. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Something about his vulnerable state stirred a deep pang of empathy in her. She glanced at his ID bracelet. Ethan Harper. Dr. Langston, the attending physician, stepped forward, issuing orders as the team sprang into action. Scans were ordered, blood was drawn, and Ethan was hooked up to a heart monitor. Sophia stayed by his side, adjusting IVs and monitoring vitals. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. He was so young, his life teetering on a knife's edge. Minutes stretched into an hour. The scans were taking longer than anticipated, and Dr. Langston had stepped out to consult with radiology. Meanwhile, Ethan's condition worsened. His heart rate slowed, and his blood pressure plummeted. His lips turned an alarming shade of blue. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to act. She recalled a case from her early days as a nurse, a young woman saved by the rapid administration of a specific medication. That memory loomed large in her mind as she watched Ethan slipping away. Her gaze shifted to the emergency medication cabinet. She knew the protocol. No medication could be administered without a direct order from the attending physician. But there was no time to wait. Ethan's numbers were dropping by the second. Her heart pounded as she approached the cabinet, her mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. Breaking protocol could save Ethan's life, but it could also cost her everything: her license, her career, her reputation. She was known for her unwavering commitment to the rules, but in this moment, they felt like shackles. Sophia hesitated, her gloved hand hovering over the syringe. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical force. She thought of her late mother, a nurse who had always told her, "Do the right thing, even when it's the hardest choice." With a deep breath, she made her decision. Her hand steadied, and she drew the life-saving medication into the syringe. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she returned to Ethan's bedside and injected the medication into his IV line. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ethan's chest rose in a faint but steady rhythm. The heart monitor beeped back to life, its steady cadence a lifeline in the tense silence. Relief washed over Sophia, but it was short-lived. The ER doors swung open, and Dr. Langston strode in, his expression a mix of confusion and anger as he saw Sophia standing beside Ethan, the empty syringe in her hand. "What did you just do?" he demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Sophia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her heart sank as the gravity of her actions hit her like a tidal wave. She had crossed a line she had never thought she would. The remainder of her shift passed in a blur. Dr. Langston was too preoccupied with the constant influx of patients to discuss the incident further, but Sophia felt the weight of his disapproval. She avoided eye contact with her colleagues, the shame of her decision gnawing at her resolve. By the time her shift ended, Ethan's condition had stabilized. He was transferred to a private room for observation. As Sophia gathered her belongings, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Curious and apprehensive, she answered. A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. Nurse Wallace, stay away from the boy in room 315. You don't know what you've stumbled into. The line went dead. Sophia froze, her mind racing. The call was more than unsettling. It was a warning. Someone was watching her, and they didn't want her involved in Ethan's case. As she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, staring into the darkness, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. Ethan Harper was more than a patient now. He was the key to a mystery she was determined to unravel. Secrets in the shadows. Sophia Wallace sat in her parked car, her mind a storm of emotions. The anonymous call had left her shaken, but it had also solidified her resolve. Whoever had called wanted her to abandon Ethan Harper's case. That alone told her there was more at stake than a routine hit-and-run. The parking lot was nearly deserted, the glow of the hospital lights casting long shadows over the asphalt. Sophia's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she replayed the caller's words in her mind. You don't know what you've stumbled into. What had she stumbled into? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. Another unknown number. Her stomach churned, but she answered. Nurse Wallace. The same deep voice said, cold and deliberate. This is your final warning. Stay away from room 315. Walk away, or there will be consequences. Who are you? Sophia demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. What do you want with Ethan? The line went dead. Sophia sat in stunned silence, her pulse racing. The fear was real, but so was her curiosity. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. She needed to know who Ethan Harper was and why someone was willing to threaten her to keep her away from him. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sophia sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She typed Ethan Harper into a search engine, her fingers trembling slightly. Dozens of results appeared, but none seemed relevant. She sifted through social media profiles, news articles, and public records, finding nothing that explained the situation. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Something wasn't adding up. If Ethan was just an ordinary young man, why would someone go to such lengths to keep her away from him? And why had his injuries been inconsistent with a simple hit-and-run? Her gaze fell on her phone. A sudden idea struck her. During her shift, she'd overheard the paramedics discussing Ethan's case. What if they had noticed something unusual at the scene? It was a long shot, but she had to try. She dialed the hospital's paramedic dispatch center. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Paramedic dispatch, this is Carlos. Carlos, it's Sophia Wallace, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to talk to the team that brought in Ethan Harper this morning. Do you know who they were? Carlos hesitated. That'd be Tom and Rachel. They're on the night shift right now. Want me to patch you through? Please, Sophia said, her heart pounding. After a brief pause, a new voice came on the line. This is Tom. Tom, it's Nurse Wallace from the ER. Sophia began. I need to ask you about the scene where you found Ethan Harper. There was a pause. Why? Something doesn't add up, Sophia said, choosing her words carefully. Did anything seem off? Tom hesitated again. Yeah, he said finally. It didn't look like a typical hit and run. There were no skid marks, no signs of a car losing control, and the road was deserted. It was like he'd been dumped there. Sophia's blood ran cold. Did you tell the police? Of course, Tom said, his voice laced with frustration. But they didn't seem too interested. They took our statement and left it at that. Sophia thanked him and hung up. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was deeply troubling. Ethan's injuries didn't match a hit and run. The scene was staged. Someone had tried to cover up what had really happened to him. The following morning, Sophia arrived at the hospital early, determined to check on Ethan. The ER was quieter than usual, the calm before the inevitable storm of mid-morning emergencies. She headed to room 315, her steps quick and purposeful. But when she arrived, the bed was empty. Her heart sank. She approached the nearest nurse's station, her voice tight with urgency. "Where's the patient from room 315? The charge nurse, an older woman named Linda, frowned. "He was transferred early this morning." "Transferred? To where?" Sophia asked, her stomach twisting. Linda shrugged. "I'm not sure. The paperwork was handled by someone from administration." Sophia's mind raced. She knew the hospital's transfer protocols well. Transfers were rarely done without consulting the attending physician or the primary nurse. Something was very wrong. Determined to find answers, she headed to the administrative office. The receptionist looked up as Sophia approached, her expression wary. "I need to see the transfer paperwork for Ethan Harper," Sophia said firmly. The receptionist hesitated. "I'm sorry, but I'm not authorized to share that information." Sophia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is important. That patient's life is in danger." The receptionist faltered, glancing around before leaning closer. The transfer was approved by Dr. Langston. Sophia frowned. That didn't make sense. Dr. Langston hadn't been on duty during the night shift. Why would he approve a transfer without consulting her? "Can I see the transfer file?" she pressed. The receptionist hesitated but eventually pulled up the electronic records. Sophia leaned over the desk, scanning the screen. The destination was listed as Lakeside Rehabilitation Center. Sophia's brow furrowed. She had never heard of Lakeside Rehabilitation Center, and a quick search on her phone yielded no results. It was as if the facility didn't exist. A suspicious encounter. As Sophia left the administrative office, her thoughts racing, she noticed a man in a dark suit lingering near the elevators. He was out of place, his presence radiating an air of authority that didn't belong in the hospital. His eyes met hers for a brief moment before he turned and disappeared down the corridor. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to follow him. She quickened her pace, weaving through the hospital hallways, but the man was gone by the time she reached the end of the corridor. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another unknown number. "You're getting too close," the voice said, colder this time. "Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Sophia clenched her jaw, anger replacing fear. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "Who are you, and what do you want with Ethan?" The voice chuckled darkly. "This is bigger than you, Nurse Wallace. Walk away while you still can." The line went dead. Sophia stared at her phone, her hands trembling. Whoever these people were, they were dangerous. But walking away wasn't an option. Ethan Harper's life was on the line, and Sophia was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Into the abyss. Sophia Wallace sat in her car outside the hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The anonymous calls, Ethan Harper's sudden transfer, and the shadowy man in the hospital corridors painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Ethan wasn't just a patient. He was a target. And she was in the crosshairs now, too. She glanced at the address she had scribbled onto a scrap of paper, Lakeside Rehabilitation Center. The name sounded innocuous, but the fact that it didn't show up in any official directories made it suspicious. Her gut told her that this was no ordinary facility. Taking a deep breath, she started the engine. If no one else was going to fight for Ethan, she would. The journey to Lakeside. The drive to Lakeside was unnervingly quiet. The roads became narrower and less maintained as Sophia left the city behind. Trees lined the edges, their skeletal branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the pale winter sunlight. The GPS indicated she was nearing her destination, but the surroundings grew increasingly desolate. Finally, she turned onto a gravel road flanked by rusted signs that read, Private EPRWPRTY. No TORESPASSANG. Her heart pounded, but she pressed on. After a few minutes, a large fenced complex loomed into view. It was a gray, nondescript building, surrounded by security cameras and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Sophia parked her car a safe distance away, hidden among the trees. As she watched the building, her mind raced. How was she going to get in? She had no badge, no credentials, and no plan, just a fierce determination to find Ethan. A chance encounter. Sophia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. She ducked behind a tree, holding her breath. Two men in uniform strolled past, their voices low but audible in the still air. "Harper's stable for now," one said. "But if he starts talking, it's over for us." "Not if he's handled properly," the other replied with a smirk. "Orders are to keep him sedated until we get what we need." Sophia's stomach churned. They were keeping Ethan drugged and isolated. Whatever he knew, they were determined to suppress it. The men walked past her without noticing, their conversation fading into the distance. She waited until they were out of sight before stepping out of her hiding spot. Her pulse raced as she scanned the fence line, looking for a weak point. She spotted a section where the barbed wire was loose and climbed over, careful not to make noise. Inside the facility, Sophia crept toward the building, her heart hammering with every step. The closer she got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The windows were covered with reflective film, and the sound of faint buzzing, likely from the electric fence, filled the air. She found a side door with a keypad and card reader. Swallowing her fear, she pulled a bobby pin from her pocket and began working on the lock. Her hands shook, but adrenaline sharpened her focus. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the tile floor. Sophia moved cautiously, keeping to the edges of the hallways. She passed rooms with heavy steel doors, each labeled with a number but no names. Occasionally, muffled voices or the faint sound of machines broke the eerie silence. Finding Ethan. Sophia finally found a small storage room filled with medical supplies and a computer terminal. She closed the door behind her and booted up the system. The login screen demanded credentials. She froze, realizing she hadn't thought this far ahead. Her gaze fell on a nearby desk. Papers were scattered across it, including a clipboard with a handwritten note. One of the guards must have jotted down a temporary password. She entered it, her fingers trembling. To her relief, the screen unlocked. Sophia quickly searched for Ethan Harper. The database loaded slowly, and she tapped her foot impatiently. When his file finally appeared, she gasped. Ethan wasn't just a patient, he was listed as a classified subject. The notes detailed experimental procedures and vague references to a project called Silent Horizon. Before she could process what she was reading, footsteps echoed in the hallway. She quickly logged out and hid behind a shelf, her heart pounding. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He glanced around, muttering to himself, before grabbing a box of gloves and leaving. Sophia exhaled sharply, waiting a few moments before slipping back into the hallway. She had to find Ethan's room. Room 27. Sophia reached room 27, her heart pounding as she peered through the small window. Ethan was inside, strapped to a hospital bed. His face was pale, and his eyes were half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. An IV line was connected to his arm, pumping a clear liquid into his veins. She tried the door handle, but it was locked. Glancing around, she spotted a guard approaching from the end of the hallway. She ducked into a nearby alcove, waiting until he passed before returning to the door. Pulling out her bobby pin again, she worked the lock until it clicked. Sophia slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "Ethan," she whispered, rushing to his side. His eyes flickered, and he turned his head weakly toward her. "You came," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Of course I did," Sophia said, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm getting you out of here." She examined the IV bag and recognized the sedative being administered. Quickly, she disconnected the line and began removing the restraints from his wrists and ankles. "Can you stand?" she asked. Ethan groaned, struggling to sit up. I'll try. Sophia helped him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulder. He was weak and unsteady, but he managed to take a few steps. The escape. Sophia guided Ethan out of the room, keeping to the shadows. The facility was quieter now, but she knew it wouldn't last. If anyone discovered Ethan was missing, the entire place would go on lockdown. They made their way to the side door Sophia had used to enter. She peered outside, her heart sinking as she spotted a group of guards gathered near the fence. They were talking and smoking, but they blocked her escape route. Ethan groaned, leaning heavily against her. We're not going that way, she muttered, scanning for another option. Her eyes landed on a maintenance door labeled basement access. It was a gamble, but they had no choice. Sophia led Ethan down a narrow flight of stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The basement was a maze of pipes, machinery, and dimly lit corridors. She searched for an exit, her ears straining for any sign of pursuit. Finally, she found a tunnel-marked emergency egress. It led to an old access point outside the perimeter. Sophia helped Ethan through the narrow passage, her breath ragged as she pushed them forward. When they emerged into the open air, dawn was breaking over the horizon. They were outside the fence, but their ordeal was far from over. We need to keep moving, Sophia said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. We're not safe yet. Ethan nodded weakly, his trust in her evident even in his fragile state. Together, they disappeared into the forest, the weight of their escape pressing heavily on their shoulders. A web of deception. The sun's early rays filtered through the dense forest canopy, casting fractured light onto the uneven ground. Sophia Wallace adjusted her grip on Ethan Harper, who leaned heavily on her shoulder. His every step was a struggle, his weakened body barely able to keep pace. Just a little farther, she whispered, more for herself than for him. Her muscles ached, and her mind buzzed with questions about the nightmare they'd barely escaped. Ethan let out a soft groan but nodded. His pale face was etched with pain, his breaths shallow. Sophia's determination hardened. They had to find shelter and answers, before whoever was after him caught up. A temporary refuge. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the woods. The structure was weathered and creaked ominously as they pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, but it offered shelter. Sophia eased Ethan onto an old couch, the springs groaning under his weight. His head lolled to the side, and she quickly checked his pulse. It was faint but steady. I need to clean your wounds, she said softly, more to keep herself focused than to reassure him. She rummaged through her backpack, finding a basic first aid kit she had grabbed from her car before heading to the facility. The supplies were limited, but they would have to do. As she cleaned and dressed Ethan's injuries, her mind churned. She replayed everything she had seen and heard at the facility. The mention of Silent Horizon, the armed guards, and Ethan's drugged state. None of it made sense. Why would anyone go to such lengths to keep him under control? Ethan, she said gently as she finished bandaging his arm, I need you to tell me what's going on. Why are they after you? He stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. They're hiding something, he rasped. Something terrible. Sophia leaned closer, urging him on. What is it? What did you find? Ethan's breathing quickened, panic flickering in his eyes. Experiments. People. Disappearing. They're using them like test subjects. Sophia's stomach turned. What kind of experiments? I don't know all the details, Ethan admitted, his voice breaking. But I saw files, data about illegal drug trials. They're testing things on people without their consent. Dangerous things. And when the trials go wrong, they make the people disappear. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. She had always trusted the healthcare system, despite its flaws. The idea that a shadowy organization could be exploiting it for such sinister purposes made her blood boil. Why were you involved? She pressed. I was a researcher, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I joined their team to help develop medical solutions, but I didn't realize what they were doing until I stumbled across the classified files. When I confronted them, they turned on me. They made it look like I'd been in an accident, but they were trying to get rid of me. Sophia sat back, her mind racing. Ethan wasn't just a victim. He was a whistleblower. And the people after him weren't just criminals. They were powerful enough to manipulate law enforcement, hospitals, and private facilities. The unexpected ally. As the hours passed, Sophia kept a watchful eye on Ethan, who had drifted into a restless sleep. She stepped outside the cabin, her phone in hand. She needed help, but she had no idea whom to trust. The hospital administration was compromised, and the police had shown no interest in Ethan's case. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A woman stepped into view, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. She was tall and lean, with sharp features and a piercing gaze. She wore a black jacket and sturdy boots, her presence radiating both confidence and caution. "Who are you?" Sophia demanded, instinctively stepping back toward the cabin. "My name's Alina," the woman said calmly. "I'm here to help." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Help? How do I know I can trust you?" Alina sighed, lowering her hands. "Because I'm one of the people who used to work for them. I know what they're capable of, and I know what they'll do if they find him." Sophia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be wary. "Why are you here? How did you find us?" "I've been following their operations for years," Alina explained. "When I saw Ethan's name pop up in their system, I knew he was in danger. I've been tracking him ever since he was transferred to Lakeside." Sophia studied Alina's face, searching for any sign of deceit. There was something about her, an intensity that seemed genuine. "If you worked for them, why aren't you still with them?" Alina's jaw tightened. "Because I saw what they were doing, and I couldn't be part of it anymore. I tried to expose them, but they buried me. I've been in hiding ever since, trying to take them down from the outside." Sophia's skepticism softened slightly. "What do you know about their experiments?" "Enough to know they won't stop until Ethan is either dead or back under their control," Alina said grimly. "And if they find you with him, they'll take you out too." Sophia felt a knot of fear in her chest, but she refused to let it paralyze her. "What do we do?" Alina glanced toward the cabin. "First, we get Ethan somewhere safe. Then, we figure out how to expose them. But we'll need proof, hard evidence that ties them to their crimes." Sophia's mind flashed to the flash drive she had taken from the facility. She pulled it from her pocket, holding it out. "I found this in their database. Ethan said it has everything." Alina's eyes widened. "If that's true, then we might have a chance. But we need to decrypt it, and fast. They'll be looking for us. On the run." With Ethan barely able to walk, and the threat of pursuit looming, the group quickly gathered what supplies they could from the cabin. Alina led them deeper into the forest, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. She explained that she had a safe house nearby, a place she had used to lay low during her own escape from the organization. The journey was grueling. Sophia and Alina took turns supporting Ethan, whose condition was deteriorating. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set Sophia's nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they approached the safe house, a small weather-beaten shack tucked into a hillside, Alina motioned for them to stop. She scanned the area, her sharp eyes catching movement in the distance. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tense. "We need to move. Now." Sophia's heart sank. They had been found. A desperate gambit. The forest was alive with the sounds of pursuit, distant voices calling out commands, the crunch of boots on dry leaves, and the faint hum of drones scanning the canopy. Sophia Wallace's pulse pounded in her ears as she crouched behind a fallen tree, her breath shallow and deliberate. Beside her, Alina peered through a pair of binoculars, her sharp features tense but focused. "They're sweeping the area," Elena whispered, lowering the binoculars. "We're running out of time." Behind them, Ethan Harper lay slumped against the trunk of an ancient oak, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His strength was failing fast, and Sophia feared he wouldn't survive much longer without medical attention. The flash drive containing the damning evidence against the shadowy organization weighed heavily in Sophia's pocket. It was their only leverage and their greatest liability. "What do we do?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling but steady. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the area again, her expression darkening. "We need a distraction," she said finally. "Something to throw them off our trail long enough for us to reach the safe house." Sophia's stomach churned. A distraction meant risk, and risk meant someone might not make it out alive. But there was no time to debate. The sound of voices was growing louder, and the faint whir of a drone buzzed closer. "I'll do it," Sophia said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "No," Elena replied sharply. "You're the only one who can keep Ethan alive. You're a nurse. He needs you. I'll lead them away." "Are you sure?" Sophia asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Despite having known Elena for only a few hours, she felt a deep respect for the woman's courage and determination. Elena nodded, her lips set in a grim line. "I've been running from these people for years. If anyone can handle this, it's me." Before Sophia could argue further, Elena rose to her feet, moving with the quiet grace of a predator. She glanced back at Sophia and Ethan, her expression softening for a brief moment. "Get him to the safe house," she said. "And don't stop for anything." Sophia nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Be careful." Elena offered a faint smile before disappearing into the shadows. Moments later, the sound of a branch snapping and a burst of movement drew the attention of their pursuers. Shouts rang out, followed by the distinct crack of gunfire. The forest erupted into chaos. A race against time. Sophia wasted no time. She slung Ethan's arm over her shoulder and helped him to his feet. He groaned in pain, his body trembling with the effort of moving. I can't do this," he muttered, his voice weak. "Yes, you can," Sophia said firmly. "We're almost there." The two of them staggered through the forest, following the route Elena had outlined earlier. The safe house was nestled in a secluded hollow, its entrance camouflaged by thick undergrowth. Sophia's legs burned, and her lungs screamed for air, but she refused to slow down. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the hidden entrance. Sophia pushed aside a tangle of vines, revealing a reinforced steel door embedded in the hillside. She fumbled with the keypad, praying the code Elena had given her was correct. With a soft beep, the door unlocked, and she pulled it open. The interior of the safe house was small but well-equipped. A narrow cot sat against one wall, and shelves lined with medical supplies, canned food, and bottled water filled the other. A single overhead bulb cast a dim, flickering light over the space. Sophia helped Ethan onto the cot, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. His pulse was weak, and his skin was clammy. She grabbed an IV kit from the shelves and quickly started a line, administering fluids to stabilize him. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to reassure herself than him. The truth unveiled. While Ethan rested, Sophia turned her attention to the flash drive. She plugged it into an old laptop she found on the shelves, her hands shaking as she waited for the files to load. The screen flickered to life, revealing a directory filled with encrypted documents and video files. Sophia clicked on the first video. The grainy footage showed a sterile laboratory filled with rows of hospital beds. Men and women lay strapped to the beds, their faces contorted in pain as medical personnel in hazmat suits injected them with unknown substances. Her stomach churned as she watched. The people in the video weren't volunteers, they were prisoners. The documents confirmed it. The organization had been abducting individuals deemed disposable and using them as test subjects for experimental drugs and treatments. Many of the subjects had died, their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves. One name appeared repeatedly in the documents: Silent Horizon. The project's goal was to develop a treatment for a rare but lucrative disease. The potential profits were astronomical, but the human cost was staggering. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. This was more than a moral failing. It was a monstrous crime. And Ethan had uncovered it all. No wonder they wanted him silenced. A narrow escape. Sophia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire. Her heart raced as she realized the noise was getting closer. Elena's distraction had bought them time, but it wouldn't last forever. She quickly backed up the flash drive's contents onto the laptop and packed it into a weathered backpack she found in the corner. Turning to Ethan, she shook his shoulder gently. "Ethan, we have to move," she said urgently. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Where's Elena?" he asked weakly. "She's buying us time," Sophia said, helping him sit up. "But we have to keep moving." Ethan nodded, his movements sluggish but determined. With his arm draped over her shoulder, they exited the safe house and plunged back into the forest. The chase. They hadn't gone far when Sophia heard voices behind them. The pursuers had found their trail. Her heart pounded as she pushed Ethan to move faster, every step a battle against exhaustion. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, a bullet striking a tree just inches from Sophia's head. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Over here," a voice shouted. Sophia turned, spotting Elena emerging from the shadows. Her clothes were torn, and her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with determination. "Keep going," Elena shouted. "I'll cover you." Sophia hesitated, but Elena's fierce expression left no room for argument. Grabbing Ethan's arm, she continued forward, her feet pounding against the forest floor. A new path. The forest eventually gave way to a desolate road, where an old truck idled on the shoulder. A man in his 60s stepped out, his weathered face etched with concern. "Get in," he called. Sophia didn't question him. She helped Ethan into the truck's bed and climbed in after him. As the engine roared to life, she caught a glimpse of Elena in the distance, still holding their pursuers at bay. The truck sped away, leaving the chaos behind. Sophia held Ethan close, her mind racing with plans. They had the evidence, but the fight was far from over. The world needed to know the truth, and Sophia wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The reckoning. The old truck barreled down the deserted road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust. Sophia Wallace clung to the edge of the truck bed, one arm wrapped protectively around Ethan Harper. His head rested against her shoulder, his shallow breaths a testament to the toll his ordeal had taken. The evidence they carried, the flash drive loaded with damning files, felt like a ticking time bomb in her pocket. "Where are you taking us?" Sophia called to the driver over the roar of the engine. "To a place they won't find you." The man replied without turning his head. His voice was gruff but calm, tinged with an air of quiet authority. "Name's Frank. Let's just say I've been around long enough to know how to stay off their radar." Sophia glanced at Ethan, whose eyes fluttered open briefly. "Hang in there," she whispered. "We're almost safe." But deep down, she knew safe was a relative term. Until the truth about Silent Horizon was exposed, none of them would truly be free. The hideout. Frank's destination was a small farmhouse nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields of tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, but Sophia's unease overshadowed the beauty of their surroundings. "Get him inside," Frank said as he parked the truck near the barn. "There's a first aid kit in the kitchen, and I've got a friend coming who might be able to help." Sophia and Frank helped Ethan inside and settled him on a worn couch. His condition had stabilized thanks to the IV Sophia had administered earlier, but he was far from out of danger. She worked quickly to clean and redress his wounds, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Who are you?" Sophia finally asked Frank as she finished her work. "And why are you helping us?" Frank leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. Let's just say I've had my own run-ins with these people, lost someone I cared about because of their projects. I've been waiting for the right opportunity to hit back, and you two just brought it to me." Sophia studied him carefully, sensing the weight of his words. "You think we can stop them?" "We have to," Frank said firmly. "That flash drive you're carrying might be the only chance we got to bring them down." Decrypting the truth. Later that night, Frank's friend arrived, a wiry man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a nervous energy. He introduced himself as Nate, a former hacker who had spent years evading authorities after exposing corruption within a major corporation. Nate set up his laptop at the kitchen table and plugged in the flash drive. "This is heavily encrypted," he muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Whoever set this up didn't want anyone poking around." "Can you crack it?" Sophia asked, standing behind him with her arms crossed. "Already working on it," Nate replied with a smirk. "But it'll take time." While Nate worked, Sophia paced the room, her mind racing. She thought about Alina, who had stayed behind to buy them time. The thought of her facing those men alone made Sophia's chest tighten with guilt. She hoped Alina had made it out alive, though deep down she feared the worst. A dangerous revelation. After hours of tense waiting, Nate leaned back in his chair and exhaled sharply. "Got it." Sophia rushed to his side, her eyes scanning the files displayed on the screen. They detailed the full scope of Silent Horizon. Human trials conducted on abducted individuals, illegal drug testing, and falsified reports submitted to regulatory agencies. Financial records revealed billions of dollars funneled into off-the-books projects, implicating high-ranking officials, corporate executives, and even members of law enforcement. "This is massive," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "If we release this, it could bring them down." "Yeah," Nate said, his expression grim. "But it'll also put a target on your back. These people don't play by the rules." "I don't care," Sophia said fiercely. "They need to be stopped." Frank stepped forward, his face set in determination. "We'll release it, but we need to do it smart. If they know where it came from, they'll shut it down before the truth can spread." Sophia nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll need multiple platforms, news outlets, social media, whistleblower networks. We have to make it impossible for them to silence this." The final pursuit. As they finalized their plan, a sudden noise shattered the tense calm. The sound of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Sophia's heart sank. "They found us," Frank said grimly, grabbing a rifle from the corner. "Nate, get that data uploading now." Sophia rushed to Ethan, who was struggling to sit up. "We need to move," she said urgently, helping him to his feet. Frank and Nate set up defenses around the farmhouse, barricading doors and windows. The air was thick with tension as the first vehicle pulled into the driveway. Armed men in black uniforms poured out, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "Stay low," Frank said, positioning himself near a window with his rifle. "We hold them off as long as we can." Sophia stayed close to Ethan, her mind racing for a way out. "Nate, how long until the upload is complete?" she called over the sound of gunfire. 5 minutes, he shouted back. "Maybe less if they don't cut the power." Sophia's gaze fell on a side door leading to the barn. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to escape. She turned to Ethan. "Can you walk?" "I'll try," he said, his voice weak but resolute. The reckoning. As the gunfire intensified, Sophia and Ethan slipped out through the side door, moving as quickly and quietly as they could toward the barn. The chaos of the firefight covered their retreat, but Sophia knew it was only a matter of time before the men noticed their absence. Inside the barn, she found an old dirt bike covered in dust. She quickly checked the fuel tank. It was half full. It would have to do. "Get on," she said, helping Ethan onto the back. She started the engine, the noise loud enough to draw attention. The men outside turned, shouting as they spotted the pair. "Go!" Frank's voice rang out, followed by another volley of gunfire. Sophia gunned the engine, the bike lurching forward as they sped out of the barn and into the night. Bullets whizzed past them, but she didn't dare look back. Her focus was on the road ahead and the promise of freedom. The aftermath. The following morning, the story broke. The files from the flash drive had been uploaded to multiple platforms, triggering a firestorm of media coverage. Headlines screamed of corruption, human rights abuses, and corporate greed. The organization behind Silent Horizon was exposed for the world to see. Sophia and Ethan watched the news from a safe house arranged by Nate. The fallout was immediate. Arrests were made, investigations launched, and the organization's operations dismantled piece by piece. For the first time in weeks, Sophia allowed herself to breathe. They had done it. The truth was out, and justice was finally within reach. But even as she celebrated their victory, Sophia knew the fight wasn't over. The people behind Silent Horizon were still out there, and their reach was long. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had proven that even the most powerful forces could be brought to their knees. And for Ethan, whose courage had sparked it all, the road to recovery had just begun. Justice unleashed. Sophia Wallace and Ethan Harper sat in the dimly lit safe house, their breaths finally steady after days of relentless pursuit. On the flickering television screen, the fallout from their efforts dominated every major news outlet. Anchors reported on the massive conspiracy behind Silent Horizon as images of executives in handcuffs and shuttered facilities filled the broadcast. But Sophia knew better than to relax completely. The organization might be reeling, but it wasn't entirely dismantled. There would be those desperate to rebuild its power and protect its remaining secrets. For now, though, the truth was out, and that was a victory. Reuniting with allies. As they watched the news unfold, a knock on the door jolted them both upright. Sophia's heart leaped to her throat as she instinctively reached for the small knife she had tucked into her boot. "It's me," came a familiar voice from the other side of the door. Sophia rushed to open it. Elena stood there, battered and bruised, but very much alive. Relief flooded Sophia's chest as she pulled Elena inside. "I thought," Sophia began, her voice breaking. "They almost got me," Elena said, her tone steady despite the exhaustion on her face. "But I wasn't about to let them win." Elena's gaze shifted to Ethan, who gave her a weak smile from his spot on the couch. "You're tougher than you look, kid," she said with a smirk. "Glad you made it." "Thanks to you," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. The group shared a brief moment of quiet triumph before turning their attention back to the news. Each report reinforced the magnitude of their accomplishment. Arrest warrants were being issued, international authorities were investigating connections abroad, and whistleblowers emboldened by Ethan's courage were stepping forward. The cost of truth. As the hours passed, Sophia couldn't ignore the heaviness that lingered in the air. For all their success, the cost had been high. Frank had stayed behind at the farmhouse, covering their escape. There had been no word from him since. He knew what he was signing up for, Elena said softly, sensing Sophia's turmoil. Frank always said he wanted to go down fighting. If anyone could hold them off, it was him. Sophia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She'd barely known Frank, but his sacrifice weighed on her. "I just hope it was enough," Sophia said. "It was," Elena assured her. "The evidence is out. They can't hide anymore." A new beginning. Over the next few weeks, life began to change. Ethan was moved to a secure facility where he could recover fully and testify without fear of reprisal. Doctors monitored his health closely, and legal teams worked tirelessly to prepare his statement. Sophia returned to her nursing duties, though her reputation as a whistleblower made her a target of both admiration and scrutiny. She was careful, watching her back and staying vigilant, but she refused to live in fear. Her role in exposing Silent Horizon had given her a renewed sense of purpose. Elena remained in the shadows, continuing her fight against the remnants of the organization. She and Sophia stayed in touch through encrypted messages, each update a reminder that their work wasn't over. the final step. Months later, Sophia found herself in a packed courtroom, sitting beside Ethan as he prepared to testify before a congressional committee. His once frail body had regained some of its strength, and his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of undeniable truth. The room was silent as Ethan recounted everything he had seen and endured. He spoke of the experiments, the lives lost, and the lengths the organization had gone to in order to silence him. His testimony was raw and powerful, leaving no room for doubt. When it was over, the room erupted in applause. Sophia felt tears well up in her eyes as she reached for Ethan's hand. He squeezed it gently, offering her a small, grateful smile. "We did it," he said softly. Sophia nodded. "We did." Epilogue. In the months that followed, the fallout from Silent Horizon continued to ripple across the world. Dozens of arrests were made, victims were identified and compensated, and new regulations were introduced to prevent such abuses from happening again. The organization's reach had been severed, and its leaders were held accountable. For Sophia, Ethan, and Alina, the victory was bittersweet. They had exposed a monstrous conspiracy and saved countless lives, but they had also paid a steep price. Frank's sacrifice, the countless victims who couldn't be saved, and the scars, both physical and emotional, that they carried would never be forgotten. But amidst the pain, there was hope. Ethan began using his voice to advocate for transparency in medicine, dedicating his life to ensuring that no one else would endure what he had. Sophia continued her work as a nurse, her unwavering determination inspiring those around her. And Alina, ever the warrior, remained in the shadows, dismantling what was left of the organization one piece at a time. Their paths were forever changed, but they had proven that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, a single act of courage could spark a revolution. The truth had prevailed, and with it came the promise of a brighter, more just future.